We are here today with John Hartman. It is Tuesday, August 13th, 2013, to discuss the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom from August 28th of 1963. Hello, Mr. Hartman.
Hello.
Please tell us about your experiences, your thoughts, your memories of that eventful day.
Well, I went on the march with my friend Kay Smith, who was a student in Boston, where I was also in school. I think she wanted me to go with her because she didn't want to go alone. I had been involved in the civil rights movement since 1960, where I met up with the Freedom Riders in Monroe, North Carolina. Had also been arrested on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1962 as part of the NAACP's effort to integrate Highway 1 and public accommodations, which at that time was the main highway between New York City and Washington. So our case went to the Supreme Court and helped public accommodations in that part of Maryland. So I had some experience already in the civil rights movement. I had recently, at that time, celebrated my 21st birthday and was waiting around for my senior year in college when Kay suggested that we go march on Washington. So we were on a bus from Boston, one of 5 or 6 buses. On our bus was the mother of the then governor of Massachusetts, Endicott Peabody. His mother was 86 years old, and she was going on the march as well. So we left South Station and drove on the bus all night. When dawn broke, we had hit the outskirts of Washington, D.C. All we could see were buses, hundreds of buses. And for me, that was really one of the most emotional times, because it meant that we were not alone in this thing, and we were being joined by hundreds, thousands of people. We had no idea how many were going to show up, but the fact that we could see nothing but buses was really quite amazing and quite emotional. So it took us a while to get to the march. There was actually no real march that we could see. The leaders of the march were meeting with Congress people, and what march there was started without them, and we were just trying to get off the bus and join the throngs of people who came. It was a very hot day, completely cloudless, sunny, so we were trying to find a good spot to hear the speeches and stay cool, which was not easy. As kind of the background to the summer, I wanted to say that in reviewing it recently, the history of it is quite different than what I recall, at least in the sense that my time perspective was off. That summer was the summer that Medgar Evers was killed, just a couple of months before the march. The Albany, Georgia movement had started primarily with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with which I was also associated. But that was a very very difficult period, and lots of people went to jail, and that was very rough. That summer was also the Birmingham demonstrations with the fire hoses, the dogs, and people being hurt and jailed. So that was kind of the background for the march. Also, President Kennedy had given a very strong speech in favor of the passage of civil rights bills in June. So I had not put all of this together until I went back over the history. Things happened very quickly, and then after the march, almost immediately after the march, was the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. I had not realized that there was that close a connection between the church bombing and the march on Washington. And then just a few months after that, President Kennedy was killed in Dallas. So you had rapidly moving historic events that, to my recollection, happened over a longer period of time. But the march on Washington itself was a truly peaceful, high watermark, I would say, of the civil rights movement. It was a tremendous logistical accomplishment to get all these people together for the largest demonstration of its kind up to that point. I later learned there were 2,000 buses, 8 trains, chartered airplanes, and there certainly were 250,000 people. There may have been more, but all of us had to somehow get food and toilets, and all of that happened for starters. And then the program itself represented a very unusual coming together of different groups that had not been used to coming together and working together before. So it was rather unique in that aspect. So you had people from the World Council of Churches, you had rabbis, the Council of Catholic Bishops, you had Walter Reuther of the United Automobile Workers who spoke, and then you had the representatives of the main civil rights organizations at that time. So it was a unique event. It didn't happen before, and it really didn't happen again afterwards. So that's why I think of it as the high watermark of the civil rights movement, and in many ways one of the finest moments for our country as a whole, because this represented people coming together for common cause at that time, making the Declaration of Independence a true reality for all of the citizens of the country. It was a televised event, so the nation as a whole was able to hear, perhaps for first time African American leaders voice their views and their demands, and I think couldn't help but be impressed by the education, the oratorical qualities, and the righteous demands of all of the speakers, really. Kay and I were most interested actually in the speech of John Lewis, because we were associated with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and we had heard, I don't know if we heard this before the march or it was a rumor circulating once we got to Washington, but we heard that John Lewis might not be allowed to speak, or that if he was going to speak, his speech would have been censored or altered in some way. So we were very interested in whether he was going to speak, and if he did, what he had to say. And we later learned that yes, his speech had been altered some, but he gave a very strong speech nonetheless. But I do have the original speech, which might be of interest historically. Even though President Kennedy had given this very strong speech in favor of civil rights legislation, SNCC felt that it was not really enough, and was always trying to push the federal government more and more, because the particular legislation that President Kennedy was in favor of wasn't going to do much for the people of Albany, Georgia, who were being oppressed in terrible ways. So John Lewis's speech really came out of some frustration, and having lived through the summer in Southwest Georgia, enduring all of this. So one part of Lewis's speech was going to be, in good conscience, we can't support wholeheartedly the administration's civil rights bill, for it's too little and too late. So they got him to leave that part out. There's another part, he said, we are now involved in a serious revolution. This nation is still a place of cheap political leaders who build their careers on immoral compromises and ally themselves with open forms of political and economic and social exploitation.
I had to leave that out too.
He had to leave that one out. He said, the revolution is at hand. We must free ourselves of the chains of political and economic slavery. The nonviolent revolution is saying we will not wait for the courts to act, for we've been waiting for hundreds of years. We won't wait for the president, the Justice Department, or the Congress. We will take matters into our own hands and create a source of power outside of any national structure that could and would assure us victory. Had to leave that out. But the line that he also had to leave out was, he said, we will march through the South, through the heart of Dixie, the way Sherman did. We'll pursue our own scorched earth policy and burn Jim Crow to the ground nonviolently. So, but even with those out, it was a strong speech, and we were most attentive to that one. Then Dr. King's speech, I was actually familiar with the outlines of it because he had given the same speech, a similar speech in Detroit during the summer, and Motown made a recording of it, which I had bought and played, and since Detroit was my hometown, I kept up on things in Detroit. So I was familiar with the speech. Nonetheless, hearing it in Washington in that setting, we knew this was something really special, and everybody stopped whatever they were doing to hear it. It was, I regard it as a kind of vision statement for the civil rights movement, but a vision statement for the ages, really. So most everyone remembers that as the key speech, and I think rightly so, but as students, and we were interested in John Lewis's speech.
Did you get the impression that there were people there to listen to everybody? Like, I mean, everybody had like someone they were looking forward to. Like you said, it was a unique blend of groups. Were there people there, it seemed like they were there maybe for this particular speaker, that particular speaker, or people there for the whole feeling in general?
I think they were there for the whole feeling in general.
The whole program in general.
We had a particular interest because of our involvement with one of the organizations, and being students and whatnot. But I think
there was
generally,
signs for everything and signage everywhere for everything and things.
That's right. It was more representation by cities and interest groups. So we were the Boston contingent. We got a visit from Bill Russell, who was the center for the Boston Celtics. It was quite easy to spot him. 6'9", 6'10", and he came over and greeted all of us, which was very, very nice. But people held signs for their cities, for their unions. There was strong union representation. Their churches, things of that sort. More than organizations.
Did you stay overnight, or did you get back on the bus around?
No. When the last speech was over, I think it was Benjamin Mays, who was the president of Morehouse College, where Dr. King went to school. After he finished, we tried to find the bus, got on the bus, and went back to Boston.
So like in a matter of 24 hours, you've like experienced this amazing thing that may never ever happen since or before or any of that.
That's right. And I think by the time we left, we thought that this had definitely been a historic moment for the country, and that we had witnessed something very special.
Did you, once you got back into Boston, were there people curious? Did people want to hear all about it, your friends or your family, or did anybody or did everybody you know went to it, or how did that work out for you to share the story and share the experience?
Well, in my case, nobody was too much interested.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. It's something now. I mean, and we were talking to someone earlier today, and it's funny how at the time you don't realize the legends that are forming, the legends that are taking place, all the iconographic type of speeches and all that, and it seemed like it was a moment that was important, but it's amazing what 50 years in perspective can change. Like you said, all that happened in those 6 months. To look at that now, that's a crazy 6 months. Perspective is an interesting thing, what it does for us. Do you feel, do you feel like there's certain things you would take away now that are different than what you took away then? I mean, do you feel that the 50 years has made a difference as far as, not a difference, but how you view it as far as then, like you're saying, it was so much more immediate, or it's sometimes happening longer, and now it's viewed back in a way that change or not change has happened? I mean, do you see something that came from it?
Well, I think the biggest thing was that this was the kind of high watermark of the civil rights movement, the time where everybody got together and agreed on a common vision, Dr. King's vision, and a common purpose. And the whole thing went so well, and the speeches were so great, and it really went downhill from there. And because so soon after having the 4 children
Yeah. I know, I couldn't believe how soon after.
murdered, that was bad. And then because the movement hadn't really gone into Mississippi, Alabama in a big way as yet, and these states were so controlled by the Ku Klux Klan that the kind of all the good feeling that was generated by the March on Washington turned into a really bitter battle. And then we had 1965 and the marches in Montgomery and Selma, which I also participated in. And then you had the city riots in Watts and
Penn State.
Newark, Detroit, and everywhere. Tampa had its own version of this, that the kind of utopian vision had given way to something much uglier and much more difficult to deal with.
Yes. But that's interesting when
So,
you look at that moment though, when it was still there.
Yeah, that moment was great, I think, for all the people who were there and all the people who saw it on TV. I think could get a sense that this was the kind of country that we wanted,
and could
but it was hard to implement those things in practical terms, in terms of voting rights and economic rights and things of that sort.
We're talking about King.
While we're the South and the country has changed dramatically in 50 years in ways that I never would have imagined at that time, you can see that there are still forces in the country that want to turn back the clock and undo a lot of the good work that has been done over 50 years. So the Supreme Court's ruling on the Voting Rights Act was a big disappointment to me. I took it personally. I take it personally since I was beaten by sheriff's deputies on horseback in Montgomery in the interest of passing the voting rights legislation. And then the verdict in the Trayvon Martin case was likewise disappointing as well. And the March on Washington originally had 2 main purposes. One was had to do with civil rights, and the other had to do with jobs and economic rights. So certainly we're still struggling mightily with the last one, and that the disparity of wealth in this country has grown larger over these 50 years, not smaller. And this is a big problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem as the years go on. So we've still got that one on our agenda. still.
And it would be nice if we could have a bringing together of all these unique groups again, like you described, and people who'd never come together before may never have come together since, but on that day they did.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty amazing for me to think about. All these different, and you look at the names on the list from the program, and you know, you've got such a representation here of groups and of what meant a lot, but obviously something meant more. Not just what their own needs were, but something was bigger for them too. You know.
So I'm curious, how did you first hear about the march? Like, when did you?
I'm not sure about that. I think Kay told me. I think she found out. She was connected with some group that was organizing people in Boston.
And what were your feelings going in? I mean, I know you said that, you know, obviously you've been involved with the civil rights movement, but what were you expecting going in? If you,
I wasn't expecting much. I had nothing to do that weekend. I was waiting for the senior year of school to start. I did not have high expectations for it. I was a little bit skeptical of it.
Why? Why were you skeptical?
Well, it was, I didn't know what it would accomplish exactly. So I was used to more direct action and demonstrations that were going to accomplish some specific goal. So I was also a little skeptical whether they could pull together an effective coalition, and really wasn't sure who was going to show up.
Right. And can you tell me a little bit about that bus ride? Maybe the type of people who were on the bus with you, whether you guys were talking a lot on the way there or not, or just kind of what the atmosphere was like, if you remember.
Well, we knew that the governor's mother was on the bus, so that.
No, then the behavior was, that's true. That probably did dictate behavior a bit, that's true.
So I mostly talked to Kay. I'm not sure who all. I think it was quite a diverse group. I think we were amongst maybe the only students. It certainly wasn't all students. It was quite a diverse mixture of people. There may have been some clergy on the bus, and everybody was quiet and trying to get some sleep. I think we left South Station at 11 o'clock, and then when we hit DC at dawn and we saw all these buses, then somebody got out a guitar and started singing freedom songs, actually.
And so seeing those buses, dawn breaking and everything, you really felt the bus come a little more alive than people?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everybody woke up and somebody got out the guitar and sang all the way into DC.
And
of course at the march itself there was Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, who were a couple by that time. Joan Baez was a favorite of mine. She sang Club 47 in Cambridge, and I think every male my age in 1960 had a crush on Joan Baez. Mahalia Jackson, Peter, Paul and Mary. Marian Anderson did come.
Was it interspersed? Was it like a speech and then some songs? They mixed it up? Okay.
And
yeah, it went on all day, so they had to keep the crowd entertained in some fashion.
And what was it like getting off the bus? I mean, I've only heard people's stories and, you know, seen some photos and things, but I assume it almost must have been like overwhelming. You know, there are all these people and all these buses, and like you said, logistically, it was a lot of work. So, if you just have any remembrance of like what was going through your head when like things were starting, and or was it just I don't know, any thoughts?
Well, we wanted to get a good spot.
Right.
We wanted to hear. They had an excellent sound system too. I don't know how they did this, but we heard all the speeches, but we just tried to get a spot because it took us so long to get in there. There was no march, so we just had to go where we could find a spot.
And do you remember where you were? Did you find shade at all? I know you're saying it's really hot.
No, there wasn't.
There was no shade to be had.
And why, you mentioned that you had heard that Lewis's speech might either be cut or edited. I don't know enough about Lewis or any. Why was that? Why do you think that people anticipated that it might be cut or that it might be edited? Because like hearing you read it, I can see why they thought, oh, okay, we should cut those pieces. But I'm just wondering why him of all people. They were like, oh, they might edit his speech. Was he known as being more radical, or just curious?
Well, SNCC was the most radical
Right.
group of the six. Yes, and I think that most likely was a rumor that we heard when we got there. We must have run into somebody who was knowledgeable. That turned out to be a rumor that was true, actually. Lots of times rumors are not true. But yes, there was all this infighting amongst the civil rights organizations, and competition for fundraising, and some ideological differences. There were generational differences, generational, ideological, and religious differences. Dr. King's group, of course, was fundamentally a religious group. SNCC was secular group. Although John Lewis himself was a devoted Christian pacifist.
And what were people's attitudes kind of throughout the day? When the speeches were happening, was everyone really attentive? Or, I mean, I'm just picturing that many people, and it's hard to keep that many people focused on something, I would think. So, was everyone?
It was. Attention varied.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we spoke to someone earlier who said how people were kind of milling in their groups, like you're saying, and kind of, you know, responding to things that meant something or hit them personally. They would respond back maybe, and I'm sure it probably was like that. What you were there, what meant the most to you, your group, you're around, you feel more passionate about maybe, or something.
Mm-hmm.
Were people like yelling back things, or people like singing out loud things as well and everything, or?
Not that I could hear. No, the group was so big, it was hard to get that kind of thing going. I think when you see film of Dr. King's speech, those immediately around him had a rapport with him, and that was probably true of the other speakers. We couldn't see this, let alone because, but we could hear it very well.
Could you really could you see them though? Could you see the people on the stage or
just vaguely? We had a hard time moving up. There were so many people. But I do have the impression that when Dr. King spoke, people stopped what they were doing.
And I know you said kind of getting back on the bus, you did have that feeling that you witnessed something that was going to mean something in the longer run. But when did it hit you, like full on, the significance of this day? Was it really then, like when you're getting on the bus, that you're like, this day is going to be, or was it months or years down the road?
Well, I myself had so many different experiences in the civil rights movement. That was one of a number, and certainly the most pleasant and inspiring one. The others were scary and difficult. But I did want to say that in terms of my involvement in the civil rights movement and my perspective on it, the time that it really hit me was around Tiananmen Square, and when this man confronted the tank, and they were the news people were talking to the Chinese students about what had led them to this protest, and they cited the civil rights movement in the United States. That was actually the time when I thought that this was really important beyond the narrow interests of the United States. So that was 80 something. Because I don't know, by 1968, and certainly when Dr. King was killed, and then whites were kicked out of SNCC. That did not leave a very good feeling about the accomplishment of the movement as far as I was concerned. So a lot of white students turned their attention to the Vietnam War and protesting against the Vietnam War and whatnot. But the civil rights movement had really come to an end by 1968, I would say.
And at that point, there was, like you said, some question of what did this accomplish, and then years down the road,
well, that's right.
Yeah.
So we knew that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had passed, but that was it. So it's only really from the perspective of this amount of time when you see the transformation in the South, in the country as a whole, that can then go back and appreciate what happened in August of 1963. But it was not clear, not as clear at that time. I mean, I had the feeling when I got back on the bus, this was really something special, and it had surprised me and exceeded certainly my expectations, which were not very high, that, you know, this was really something. But only with the passage of 50 years and looking back, can we appreciate, I think, how special it was and how important it was in the transformation of the country. But no, it was not clear, not at all clear at that time, and in 68, 69, 70, things didn't look good at all.
well, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you.
We're gonna go upstairs for a little bit. I'll still chat.